Thanks a million, Roisin. I'm just going to try and share my screen. Work. There we go. Okay. So thanks a million, Roisin. I know Mark this morning was talking about interpretive panels as part of his discussion about different types of interpretation that can be used. But what I'm going to look at today, or the approach I wanted to take really, is about community created, or give tips to community groups maybe that are thinking of doing interpretive panels. Because yes, we know that Ireland's Ancient East, or Fáilte, the OPW and so on create these panels, but sometimes they're being done in smaller communities and smaller towns by groups of volunteers, be it the Tidy Towns group or the local historical society or so on. So it's going to be a combination of a few practical considerations that you may or may not have thought of, and then some more sort of theoretical thoughts about interpretation and what it is as well. So I'll probably overlap a little bit with some of the things that were said earlier, but hopefully it'll be useful. So basically, interpretation panels, they're such a common sight at heritage sites all over the world, really. We've all seen them. And they're so common that it almost seems an obvious and an easy first choice sometimes when it comes to choosing a way of drawing attention to your heritage or telling the story of your site or your location. However, having made that decision, it's only when you actually sit down and you're faced with deciding on what goes onto the interpretive panel that you realize that there's actually quite a few decisions to be made, there's factors to be considered, and indeed various different stories that can be told. So I want to focus on the content and presentation, but as with all projects, and especially when you're going to be applying for grants, which many of us would be, preparation and budgeting are going to be vitally important to this project for you as well. You're going to have to ask yourself questions like, what format is it going to be? What size is it going to be? Who's going to make it? Are we going to do one panel? Are we going to do a series of panels? Is it part of a trail? Is it standalone? Do we need permission to put them in the places we're thinking of putting them? So you'll have to talk to your local council and things like that, or property owners. Are they going to be accessible? And there's different layers of accessibility. I read somewhere recently there's 40,000 wheelchair users in this country. So if you're putting them somewhere, is it going to be somewhere that someone in a wheelchair can read it or even get near it? Buggies come into that as well. A lot of people who are visiting our sites might be pushing a buggy. And then there's other accessibility issues that I'll mention again. Do we need the input as a community group of professionals, and are they too expensive and that sort of thing? The answer to do you need the input of a professional, more than likely at some stage at least, the answer is yes. At the very least, depending on what skills might be available to your community group, you'll need a graphic designer, for example. But I do strongly recommend getting some sort of heritage professional involved who has experience interpretation, who can help to lead you through and make the most effective panel that you can. But anyway, as I said, I want to concentrate mostly on content. And I have 4 main points as we go through. They overlap a little bit, but hopefully it reinforce the ideas. Number 1, and it's been mentioned before, know your audience and think about your audience. Who is the panel for? It's not necessarily for members of your local history group that may already know quite a bit about it, but it's for the wider local community. It's for people from a broader geographical community who might, not be from too far away. It could be for tourists who are from a long way away. It could be for the young, it could be for the old. You want to try and reach as broad an audience as you can. And I like this quote. It appears, although I added the woman bit, it appears in that lovely book, Board of Boards, that was published by the Heritage Council a while ago, and you can find it on the Heritage Council website, and kind of touches on things Mark was saying, that there are different things to do other than interpretive panels, but we're going to focus on the panels today. So think like a wise man, but communicate in the language of the people. One of the things I want, and a nod back to what I was saying about accessibility, it's important that we consider readability of these things, and literacy and people's ability to actually read. It seems a basic thing, but we all know people who have dyslexia, for example. It's very, very common. And this is why you have to sort of take this into consideration when you want to reach as broad an audience as possible. So when you're putting it together, have you considered what makes a text easier to read? There's a few simple steps that you can make, such as using a single color background with a really good contrast between the color of the text and the color of the background. Preferably a dark text against a light background is easier to read. Avoid using sort of solid blocks of text. Try and break it up into smaller paragraphs or use subheadings, things like that. That makes it easier to read as well. And then, you know, colorblind people, do you consider that? For them, you avoid using pink or red or green because they can't see them, so they're not going to be able to read it. And another thing to do when you're dealing with your graphic designer is talk about what kind of fonts that they use, what sort of shape the letters are literally, because some fonts are easier to read than others, and there are actually fonts such as this one that are designed for people with dyslexia. They actually find it easier to read, and it's not going to make it more difficult for anyone else to read. So maybe we should be considering these things a bit more. It's very important to bear in mind the different levels of engagement that the panel is going to receive. And we've all done this and we've all seen it. There's people who will walk up to the panel, look at the title and look at the picture, and that's all they want. They're quite happy. There's others who will look at the title, the picture, and they might start reading, but they're not going to get to the end. But they're quite happy with that, and that's fine. There's the ones who will look at everything and walk away saying, I never knew that. They're my favorite people. I love hearing those words after a tour, a panel, or anything like that, because you feel like, okay, I've sparked something there. And then you'll have some people who will read the whole thing and be fascinated and pick out a few keywords and later go and look at all that. We love those people too. But all these people are important and they're all relevant. So you have to keep these things in mind when you're designing your panel. A brief word about language then. Our main languages here obviously are English and Irish. Most people will be, certainly when you get to community groups, very often the panels will be in English. Sometimes they'll include Irish. I've been asked before, you know, do you have to do Irish? There's no law that says that you do. Some panel creators are obliged to do it, such as the state, they'll always have both, and other state bodies. Some sponsors, depending on who's sponsoring your panel, may require you to have English and Irish, and that's fine as well. And then as a creator yourself, you may choose that, you know, you want to have both. But the main observation I would say is that you need to make this decision at the beginning of the project. The biggest, there's two key things. One is that by providing the Irish translation, you still have the same amount of space on your panel, so you are going to be providing half the information that compared to if it was all in English. So you have to bear that in mind. And the other thing is you're going to need someone to translate it and check that the Irish translation is correct. So there are other ways, and as was mentioned earlier on, there are other ways and more technical ways of adding different languages. And this is the bit at the top here with the QR codes. It's actually from an Ireland's Ancient East panel that went up recently in Milford in Carlow. Very nice panels actually. But they've provided these QR codes which give you links to the text on the panels in the various languages. So they've Irish, German, French, Spanish, and Italian, which is a great idea and is something to be considered. But this ties into the management and maintenance issue that was brought up before as well, because if you're a community group, what is the website that these are bringing them to? Are you going to have your own website which you have to maintain, or would you be able to find you know, some community based website or something like that that you can use where the information will still be there in 5 years' time? So, you know, there's that element of it as well. And once again, that's 5 languages. Are you going to need 5 translators and pay them to do all the translation as well? So there's nothing wrong with doing all this, but it will have to be tied into the budget somehow. I included it's a little bit fuzzy, I apologize, but the image on the bottom right there, it's actually a panel, one of many panels at the Roman fort of Vindolanda on Hadrian's Wall over in England that I visited a couple of years ago with the Wall Thames Network, actually, great trip. And it's a little reminder of how language can be used to add another interesting element to your interpretation. So what they've done here is, and I apologize again, you can't really read it, but wells and water tanks, they have that translated into Latin underneath. Now, I don't think they expect any of their visitors to be fluent in Latin, but it's a reflection of, you know, the language that would have been used at the site back in Roman times. And, you know, something like that can add another little element could be, useful on, say, a medieval monastic site here or something like that. But it's also a reminder that sometimes people like to use a little bit of Irish. So what I've seen done is where a panel might all be in English, but they might have the title in both English and Irish. So that's just another little thing to consider. So my second main sort of issue that you need to think about, and it's a very important one, is what is your key message? What do you want the audience to learn from your interpretation panel? And this is where we have to consider the difference between two things. One is information. And this is where a plaque or a memorial or something like that, it gives you facts about a place or a person. One here is about the fact that a certain writer used to live in this house, but it doesn't say much more than that. The one on the right commemorates the fact that this is the birthplace of St. Lawrence O'Toole. There is text at the bottom that says a little bit more about his life. But really, it's a presentation of fact, linking facts to that place. So the difference between information and interpretation. And interpretation gives you a little bit more. Good interpretation enhances the visitor's sort of intellectual and emotional connection to the place. It evokes a really strong sense of place, which has been mentioned before as well today. And it should be accessible to as broad an audience as possible. And it's also based on very sound research. So just to give you two examples here, again, slightly fuzzy image on the right, I apologize. But the photograph on the left is taken at Rindoon, which is, a deserted medieval walled town, as many of you are familiar with, I'm quite sure. This photograph was taken over here somewhere. I don't know if you can see my cursor, but over on the left of the photograph, looking towards this town wall, you can see that, bits of the wall there, and there are the ruined castle and so on. But the interpretation panels interpret what the information that we have about Rindoon, and it shows all the burgage plots and the street and what the wall looked like as it was, in complete state. So it's telling you that a little bit more. It's not saying there was a medieval walled town here, full stop. It's giving you a much broader picture and a much deeper understanding of the site. And then another example that we're working on at the moment in Castledermot, the garden behind the library. At the moment, it's an empty garden. There's hopes to do a bit more with it. But the picture on the left, if you look carefully, you can see little arches in the stonework, and they're blocked up bee bowls, which not everybody knows about. And bee bowls were little alcoves in the wall where the traditional straw beehives were kept. They obviously went out of use and it all got blocked up. So it's all very well to say these are bee bowls. You could just write a small plaque that says that. But by getting an interpretive reconstruction picture done on the right, done by Mark, that we heard earlier, it's suddenly you understand it so much better. You see the beekeepers at work, you see all the bees, you see the garden, little corner of the garden brought to life. And it just means that little bit more. That's the difference of interpretation. Good interpretation also has to be culturally sensitive and respect different points of view. And I think we're probably all a little bit more aware of all this since the dawn of all the decade of commemorations. I think the whole country has been on a little journey of discovery as far as all this. And this is a really nice example that's been prepared for Middleton recently. And thanks to Damien Shields and Sarah Nyland for letting me show you this. The kind of language that is used in these things, it's a statement of fact, but it still gives you a little human insight into the events. And the other thing I like about this panel is it's a really nice example of how one information panel can be used to portray an event that has actually happened on different little locations in the same landscape. So you can see they have the numbers there indicating the progress and what happened and when it happened, and the information then in the box on the left. Other little events depicted in more detail. And this brings me on to my next point. Your panel needs to tell a story. So as I say, as a lovely fact as well, dry words and dry facts will not fire hearts. And that's what people remember. Everybody wants to hear a good story. That's what we're all interested in. And for panels, there's three main elements to consider, which I touched on when I was looking about the 4 levels of engagement. The fact that people looked at the title, they look at the image, and they look at the text. So there are 3 things. The title is the first piece of text that people are going to read. It can be very straightforward. You could just say medieval Kilkenny, something like that, and that's absolutely fine. But it can be fun and it can be attention grabbing to try something a little bit different. So that Rindoon poster on the right again, light on the edge. What do they mean by that? And already you're asking yourself a question and you're going in to try and find out what do they mean. And I love the one on the left. I just came across it on social media during the week, Blundell Castle in Eden Derry. And the panel, you can just see on the left-hand side, what used to be here? It's asking a very simple, straightforward question, but you instantly want to know the answer, and you're wandering over to have a look and see, well, what did used to be here? Why have they done this, and why is it there? And so you're immediately engaging with them. Images are so important to this. In contrast to a book or a leaflet or anything like that, in panels, the text is supporting the image more than the image is supporting the text. The image needs to attract the viewer's attention. It needs to make them a little bit curious, but it needs to teach them something as well. And I find that this can be done by showing them something new. So using things like antiquarian drawings that they may not have come across, archive photographs, reconstruction drawings like we saw before, and like on the Rindoon posters, even maybe images of artifacts that might have been found in local excavations if they're good quality. But you have to know to budget for these things. If, say, you're using antiquarian drawings that are in the National Library, for example, there may be a fee, you have to get permissions. So again, this has to be decided, early enough in the planning phase. There's no point in putting a photograph of how the site looks now on a panel because they're standing in front of it. They can see what it looks like now. So you want to give them something different to think about. Maps are also useful, and old maps, antique maps, can be very useful and give a lot as well. Labels and captions make them clear, brief, easy to read, easy to understand, and so on as well. And just to give you one or two examples, so this again is near me at home. Mullacrelan is a forest park. It belongs to Cuilche, it's run by Cuilche. And this panel, as you can see behind the panel, the place is completely overgrown with trees. You can still get into the interior of the ring fort, all the way around it, right up to the banks, and even over the banks and into the ditch, there is now trees. You don't really get a sense of the monument if you don't know the monument is there. And a large part of the panel is this photograph. And the photograph was taken, I think, in the 1950s, before most of this Cuilche forest was there. And it doesn't say a huge amount, but you can see the monument, you can see the big ditches and the banks and so on. And in combination, looking at that and being on the site, you suddenly have a much better understanding of what the site is. And I was glad we saw an image earlier as well of the Carlingford panels. I was in Carlingford last year, just before everything went south. And I thought these panels were beautiful. This one in particular, it's well positioned there. It's got an attractive image that draws you over to have a look, and then hopefully you read a bit more text as well. But it's lovely in that it's positioned there and you can see what the castle used to look like versus what is there at the moment. And it's a really nice example of that. Now, text. The image on the left is just to remind you that you're not writing a book once again. And it's a little bit like what Mario was saying. You don't want to, if you're giving a walking tour, you don't want the walking tour to be 5 hours long. With an interpretive panel, you don't want people to have to stand there for 20 minutes reading, because that's not what they came there to do. Okay, if they want to read a book, they'll go and sit somewhere and read a book. So a panel can't tell you the whole story. It can't tell you all the stories, and this is why picking your message that I mentioned earlier on is so important at the beginning. You're giving the reader an insight that hopefully is going to contribute towards a rewarding and memorable experience at the location. That's what you're aiming for. And if they want to know more, then they can go and find out more elsewhere. I stuck in that picture there also as a little reminder. We've been talking a bit about kids and interacting with kids and kids interacting with the history of the site, and just sort of a hark back really to the image and tying into the text. What I've seen very often with my own family, especially when they were smaller, is the kids will go up and look at the picture and go, "Ooh, what's that, Dad?" or "What's that, Mum?" or why is that like that? Which draws Mum and Dad in to read the text and explain it to the kid. So, it's intergenerational from that point of view as well. And I'm just going to mention briefly then, I've had various conversations with people over the last few years about how long the text should be. And that seems to be $1 million question at the moment. I know Mark said earlier it should be about 100 words. It all depends. It depends if you're doing English and Irish, very often that's only what you will fit. But I don't see anything wrong with going longer than that. As long as you don't have a big heavy block of text, if it's broken up into different, different paragraphs or different subheadings, if you have it in different sections, people don't feel they have to read all of them. They might pick out 1 or 2 bits to read. And that's, as I said before, that's fine. Also avoid jargon and boring language, the kind of things that should just be in reports and nowhere else. And don't worry that, by simplifying the text that you're dumbing it down. You're not necessarily dumbing it down. You're just making it accessible. You're making sure that as many people as possible can read it and not feel under pressure in doing so. And that they don't lose interest, of course. And just 2 examples here. This panel on the left is the one I mentioned earlier about. There's actually 2 on the site about the Alexander family of Milford. And you can see that the text is broken up into different paragraphs. People can dip in and out of it as they wish. There's various images to look at. The one on the right is from Roscommon Castle. It's got some fabulous reconstruction images of the castle at different times, 1307 and 1584. But there's quite a lot of text in this one, and some people could find that off-putting. Maybe it should have gone on to more than 1 panel or something like that. But, it's hard to know the story. But that can work in that if you have, this is in a local park that's used by the locals a lot, you could have people who come back and read a different bit every time. But, these are just things that you have to consider. Finding something relatable, and this kind of ties into your storytelling and so on. Knowledge becomes understanding when it's coupled with feeling, and that's so true. If you can relate to a person or a thing or something in the story, a bit like what we're hearing about Henrietta Street and how the objects and things can be so evocative to people and bring the stories out. It can be something that it could be something that relates to people's work that catches their attention. It could be their hobby, like beekeeping. It could be their home life. It could be some other part of their interests, for example. But mostly what people relate to are other people. Again, think of beekeepers and so on. But there's other things as well. And this is, I visited Chester last year, again, just before everything locked down. And you have the Roman gardens there, and there's some archaeological remains, but the panel there is explaining all about how their underfloor heating system worked. And of course, nowadays we all know what underfloor heating is, so people understand what they're on about. And then this one recently down in Kilmore Quay, reconstruction drawings of the medieval ships. So all that's there is the ship, but you're already standing on the quay side and you're looking at the modern boats that are there. So it's not a big jump for the imagination to picture, the air covered in these kind of ships instead. So, that really works as well. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to flick through. So these are the key points that I was saying. Know your audience, identify your message, find something that people can relate to, tell a story. Don't try and tell them everything, because you can't, you will fail. And avoid jargon, consider their knowledge base. A sort of more practical checklist of things that maybe to bear in mind when, again, you are the one organizing these panels. Make sure your text is relevant, fact-checked, proofread. Images, make sure you have permission to use the image. Just because it's on the internet doesn't mean that you're necessarily free to use it. So you need to look into these things. Make sure there's a caption. Attribution. If someone like, again, the National Library gives you the image, you will have to say that it's copyright or, reproduced courtesy of them or something like that, or even your local photographer or whoever it is. It's always nice. It's a way of saying thank you. And then other little housekeeping things that may have to go onto your panel. Is there an acknowledgement? Do you need to sort of say thank you to local historian, whoever, for doing all the research for this? If you have sponsors, be it the Heritage Council, Walltown Network, the County Council, make sure their logos are going on there somewhere. And if you're using something like QR codes, make sure that they work. Always double check these things. And just to finish, At the end of the day, you want to have a sign, in our case, that suits the needs of the end user. It should appeal to the broadest number of people, but doesn't have to be dumbed down to be accessible, just thought out carefully first. So just remember that good interpretation is based on facts, but it reveals what the object, place, feature, or whatever means, why it matters, and why it is relevant. So I'm going to finish there. I hope I've put some useful facts and useful ideas out there for you all. Happy to take any questions. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much.